News broke yesterday across the internet of Francis allegedly, along with Cardinal Arthur Roche, getting ready to drop the inevitable hammer again on traditional parishes, on the traditional Latin Mass. This was thought to be inevitable. For years, we've had this rumor coming that Cardinal Roche had at least the outline of a document ready to present to Francis, that he sought permission to do this already, and Francis told him no, that he was not that interested in this at this time, that he had other things to worry about. There's a timeline of events. I'm going to go over this for you here so you understand where we are, because there's some context here that lends credence to this. Our story comes from today, Rorate Caeli, who are, quite frankly, very good on this issue. They have had contacts in Rome who gave them Traditionis Custodes, essentially, the key points of it, weeks or even months ahead of time. Their track record is very, very solid. I'm also going to give you a brief take from a respectable figure who thinks that this is implausible also, to counterbalance this. My own take on this is that this will probably focus predominantly on diocesan organizations, because the diocesan traditional masses, this is not an FSSP thing, an Institute of Christ the King thing, or even SSPX, but your normal diocesan parish, plenty of which still offer traditional masses. Statistically, something like 3/4 of Catholics who attend the traditional mass do so with in an actual diocesan setting. And that is what Traditionis Custodes was predominantly aimed at. So we will go and do that. And talk about this in some depth while trying to do it quickly. But I want to start this with reminding you of the rhetoric that comes out of Rome. This came from the National Catholic Reporter on an entirely different subject, but the underlying nature of this what you see here puts the lie to everything that Rome talks about when it comes to unity and welcoming and being accompanying and dialoguing and the rest. Headline from the National Catholic Reporter: Rome's true nature is to be welcoming, caring for all, Pope says. Trads need not apply. Of course. Keep all this in mind also in the context of synodality. Synodality plays a big part in this story that I don't think anybody has talked about in that way. The whole point of synodality is to essentially have the laity actively participate in the governing of the church. That is one of the things that we're told is necessary for the church to survive, that we must get with the times and let the laity have a hand in decision-making in the church. And the great critique of the modernists is that the traditional liturgy does not involve active participation, because they don't believe praying along with the priest is active participation. And that tells you everything you need to know about their position. Let's talk about a little bit of a timeline here, but I do want to remind people that those of you who are channel members, through that join button, you get a free super chat once a month. Please feel free to use it. It doesn't cost you anything extra to do it, and it highlights your question so I can see it, and that way, I'm less likely to accidentally skip what you're saying. So, a couple things to remember here on the story. Traditionis Custodes, in a letter from Pope Francis to the bishops that went with it, explicitly said that its purpose was to re-educate traditional Catholics into how great Vatican II and the new Mass are. To that end, after Traditionis Custodes was first issued, we saw a couple of things happen immediately. One was that a few bishops tried to crush their TLM offerings entirely. They were probably the ones who were in the know about the document and were prepared ahead of time. A few others tried to ignore the document, some using canon law to ignore it entirely. That didn't exactly go over well for them either. The rest took a prudent amount of time to implement the document. Eventually, it was basically universally implemented, especially after the Responses ad Dubia was released in December that year, as the rumored follow-up that made the whole thing even worse. The Responses ad Dubia was submitted to Rome from a source that nobody knows who submitted it, which is unusual. Dubia usually have the name of the priest or bishops or laity attached to it who submitted it. This time it was from just a mysterious group of bishops. You can guess who they were. I suspect, but I can't prove, that they were a group of American or European bishops who were thoroughly through and through Bergoglians. And they asked very specific questions to get a very specific answer from Rome. And the answers that we got made Traditionis Custodes much worse. Now, some dioceses asked Rome for a dispensation to implement the document more slowly in one form or another. The ones that were granted that dispensation received a form letter. It was a form letter. I reported on these repeatedly, and the text was virtually the same in every single one of them. And it told them that they had 2 to 3 years to implement Traditionis Custodes. If we go with a 3-year number, those 3 years are up this fall for most of them. That's the key part here. By early 2025, virtually all of the extensions granted to dioceses will have expired. That's where we are now with this. A sunset that is coming very quickly for diocesan traditional Latin masses. It's also worth noting that the FSSP and the rest weren't really all that affected by Traditionis Custodes, except with the overwhelming increases in attendees to their masses. I saw it at my parish. There were in the live chat before the live stream, people talking about their SSPX chapel had 3 times the people it did before the events of 2020, and especially Traditionis Custodes. And Traditionis Custodes led to more Catholics deciding to drive long distance each way for Mass on Sunday. My family does that. Many of you do that. There are people I have spoken with who drive 2 to 3 times the long distance that I and my family do every Sunday to go to Mass. That is a reality that's probably coming for more people. That or just submitting dutifully to it. But in terms of operating, the FSSP and similar organizations were largely unaffected, except in one important way. Some bishops read Traditionis Custodes to mean that they could not invite the FSSP and groups like them into their dioceses at all. That was not universally true in all places, but it seems to be the case in at least a few. The FSSP, along with the SSPX and the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest, and all similar organizations, all have high levels of seminarians and traditional transitional deacons at this time, meaning in the final year of seminary before becoming a priest, typically, although that period can last longer, a seminarian gets ordained to the diaconate. Not with it being a permanent diaconate, but with that being the final year or two where they are in active service in dioceses and things, getting the hands-on training needed to be a priest so they can see what's going on and doing all the things associated with the holy orders of the diaconate before they become a priest. They have lots of them. All of these groups do. And new ordinations are coming soon that are going to give them what is for them record numbers of priests. I haven't bothered reporting on those stories because on the high levels of them, but you'll see these images of just lists of these organizations and their seminarian numbers, and they are staggering how many they have. And that it is a good news thing that they have that many, obviously. But this is where we are now. The priestly fraternities have large numbers of priests, relatively speaking, but in many cases, they don't have a way to get new parishes started due to the restrictions, or because of just another nuts and bolts problem that they have. They may have seminarians, but they don't have the material resources to get access to spaces to put their chapels in. The SSPX famously have a very long wait list for communities that desperately want them there because they don't have the properties. And either the properties they get are either owned by the society or sometimes owned by laity who rent them to them so they can have masses there, but they don't have the resources for those properties. There is a very long wait list. The SSPX chapel in Oklahoma City, the priest famously comes in on Sunday morning to hear confessions and offer the Mass and do other sacramental things. And then within an hour after Mass is closed, he's hopping into a vehicle and driving for a Mass at some otherwise, to me, unknown location to offer Mass for people in the hinterlands somewhere. They don't have even the priests and vocations they need to keep up with demand, let alone the spaces to do it. And that is another problem with this. This is on top of credible rumors, by the way, though, that Francis is about to grant the SSPX a few new bishops with his approval from among their own ranks, lending credence to the other credible rumor that we all know about already, and this is something to keep in mind when we go over this story, the siloing of traditional priestly fraternities and the faithful attachment to them into these isolated communities. Keeping traditionally minded Catholics as if we have some affliction that they want to prevent from spreading to the rest of the faithful by keeping us as far from the rest of the church as possible. There are stereotypes that go along with this. My FSSP parish is in literally the toxic waste part of town of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's just where it is. That is one of the oldest stereotypes out there. There's literally on Facebook a satire page called the traditional Latin Mass in the toxic waste part of town as a sort of a commentary page that posts memes and jokes about this kind of stuff, because it's the case often that you'll either find them there or way far flung outside of the city limits in the middle of a rural area, just long enough to go for that people who say, well, I would go to the traditional mass, but I don't have one within a 5-minute drive of my house. If this document drops soon, as it, if Rorate Caeli, who's very credible with these things, is correct, then people who have that kind of take on it are going to be faced with the reality of having to do a long distance drive like the rest of us, or quote unquote dutifully submitting to this decree from Rome. Traditionis Custodes has in it a statement that the normal mass, we'll call it the sole expression of the Roman rite, as they call it, is supposed to be offered with reverence and respect to the Eucharist, but it has never been enforced. That's just them paying lip service to it. And so you'll be paid. So if you dutifully submit to this by going back to the new mass, you're going to find yourself in a position where you're going to have to tolerate either overt liturgical abuse, or at the very least, just lax liturgy and watered down homilies and all the rest of it, and dealing with the one thing almost no one wants to talk about, which is that your typical ordinary form parish, among young people, there's an 85% attrition rate. They receive confirmation and then they stop going to mass almost entirely at staggeringly high rates that are not nearly that high in traditional parishes. And this is why my family, I have any say in this, will never return to the ordinary form of the mass. We just never will, because my kids' souls are on the line. I know some people will be very angry that I said that. Don't care. But we are facing a sunset date that is approaching from Traditionis Custodes. It was meant to suppress diocesan TLMs. That's very clear on that. And perhaps, depending on how a bishop reads it, to prevent the priestly fraternities from being able to come in, giving him an excuse to not allow them to come in. Because aside from the SSPX, the FSSP, the Institute of Christ the King, and all the rest of those kind of groups have to have the permission of the local ordinary to offer the mass in their diocese. And you combine that with how the traditional religious orders, usually the male ones, but often the nuns and things too, who are dedicated to sacred tradition, are all the ones that I keep reporting on to you, where their local bishop decides to try to crush them. And I think part of the reason is because they're dedicated to tradition, they have a mass offered there. And it's not that hard to go to a mass with a religious community. It's not that hard at all to do that. It's a conservative-ish Novus Ordo Benedictine monastery, 5-minute drive from my house. I could go to mass there every Sunday if I wanted to. I don't, but I could. And with the traditional ones, it's not that hard either. You just got to know when it is and if it's actually open to the public, because some don't make them open to the public. But this is likely going to be a diocesan affecting document if it's real. It's also worth noting here that the FSSP have published on one of their websites a handwritten note written on a napkin or a piece of random paper, a note from Francis promising them that the FSSP will always be able to offer the 1962 liturgical books and TLM in perpetuity. That note cannot be found anywhere in the official Vatican records on their website, so in reality, its binding nature is at best dubious. I wouldn't place any hopes on that document protecting the FSSP. I'm not trying to scare people about the potential crushing of the largest non-SSPX group, but I wouldn't use that document as a shield. But here's a basic timeline for you to remember. Traditionis Custodes was issued on the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel in 2021, July 15th, 2021. The Responsus ad Dubia was issued on December 18th, 2021, which corresponds to a Marian feast day on the pre-1954 liturgical calendar, something only traditionalists would generally notice. And then 2 years after that, by the way, Fiducia Supplicans was issued on that same date. That's not a coincidence. But the 3-year period seems to have started somewhere between those two feast days, or in some cases immediately thereafter. That's where we are. And so I will remind you again that Rorate Caeli has an incredible track record on getting these things right. So we go to Rorate Caeli. So they tell us that this will be kind of the final way of doing away with a traditional Latin Mass. I suspect, again, this will be, if it's real, it'll be diocesan predominantly, but who knows? They have surprised me before. Fiducia Supplicans was way more in your face about that issue than I ever expected them to get, hence the backlash they got. So here is their report. Dear readers, Once again, at least twice in the past, before the crackdown on the Franciscans of the Immaculate and in the 12 months leading up to Traditionis Custodes, Rurate Caeli is said to be the first bearer of grave, heavy, and persistent rumors coming from the circles close to Cardinal Roche and the liturgical warriors close to Casa Santa Marta in Rome. An attempt is being made to implement, as soon as possible, a Vatican document with a stringent, radical, and we'll call ultimate solution, banning the traditional Latin Mass. The same ideologues who imposed Traditionis Custodes and its implementation, and who are still frustrated with its apparently slow results, especially in the United States and France, want to ban it and shut it down everywhere and immediately. They want to do it while Francis is still in power. They want to make it as wide, final, and irreversible as possible. Now, we'll pause here for something. This could very well be because they recognize that Francis doesn't have much time left, but also it could very well be that despite the fact that Francis has put in something like 75% of the cardinals who will take part in the next conclave to give us the next pope, they don't like their chances of getting a Francis II, or they're hedging their bets. Probably the latter, but I suspect they're being driven to do this now because the next pope is likely to be a older pope who will be a moderate placeholder, who won't let them continue Francis's agenda for the 4 or 5 years that the next one is around, because it's likely that the College of Cardinals will choose someone to heal the rifts in the church and try to bring everybody together and cool the rhetoric and all the rest of it. That's a very high probability chance. And when I say moderate, I tend to mean someone like, think of someone like Benedict XVI, who would you take all the theological writings out from what he didn't actually do all that much in terms of actively doing things in the church. He wrote a lot of theological documents, but he didn't do, cracking down on the James Martin types or anything like that to any real degree. You might see somebody like that if you don't get a Francis II. These rumors come from the most credible sources in different continents, and we urge you to take them as seriously as possible and do what you can in your station, as laity, priests, bishops, cardinals, religious men and women, to prevent the ban from becoming a concrete measure. Can we stop it from happening? Yes, we can by prayer, sacrifice, penance, and influence and pressure of whatever sort we can manage to put forward. The enemy is strong, but our Lord and our Lady are mightier. When we have further information that can be made public, we will let you know. And here's a note about their source. They say, what we can say is that these rumors come from very same sources that revealed to Rurate that the Vatican has sent out a survey to bishops on Summorum Pontificum in preparation for what would become Traditionis Custodes. And Rurate was the first source to report this. And the very same sources who first revealed that a document like Traditionis Custodes would come. And Rurate was also the first to reveal it at that time, with the addition of other credible sources who have now mentioned the same present rumors, and whom Rurate was not acquainted with at the time of Traditionis Custodes, and now who corroborate them. Now, a lot of people will be like, oh, these are rumors, you shouldn't take them seriously. Well, Rurate's track record on this is very, very credible. This is not a, like a rumor from the kinds of sources that said, oh, they're going to do an apostolic visitation to the FSSP and destroy them right afterwards. Not like that. This is a much more credible source. And now I'm going to give you something here from 1 Peter 5. They give some good advice on this, but I'm not sure how people will take it, because 1 Peter 5 is, as traditionalists go, very restrained in their calls to action. So here's what I believe it's Tim Flanders wrote. Let's take a look again just to make sure. Yeah, this is from Tim Flanders. The text above repeats what Rurate posted. He says, without a doubt, Rurate is a credible and trusted source for this important news, and the recommended actions can never be too frequently recommended. We can prevent bad things from happening to our TLMs by prayer, penance, and whatever influence we can muster on our priests and bishops. The most important part of our spiritual preparation for whatever comes next is twofold. One, to study the lives of our trad godfathers, who endured much worse than these, and probably worse than what comes next. Have you heard of the 1970s? These trad godfathers are the ones who publish here at 1 Peter 5. For a look into the crusading spirit of our trad godfathers, listen to Father Charles Murray, who laughs at the enemies of Christ in their filth in the 1970s. And then an interview with Father Charles Murray. The second thing is contained in our founding passage from 1 Peter 5. Be you humbled, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in the time of visitation. The fact is, the Catholic response to evil is the virtue of patience, to suffer evils well. In order to do this, we must consider that the wrath of God is being poured out upon us for our sins. We simply do not deserve to have the TLM, but God deserves it, and our children deserve it. So let us be purified by the wrath of God, and beg his mercy, so that we may know again his loving kindness and the ancient rites of our forefathers. As the Apostolic Roman Rite says in the Collect of Thursday after Ash Wednesday, O God, who by sin are offended and by penance appeased, graciously regard the prayers of thy people making supplication to thee, and turn away the scourge of thy wrath, which for our sins we deserve. And then they'll have a round table, I guess, on their channel with, some people, some trad commentators. And if you are looking for someone saying, well, this is probably not real, I will give you here. This is Dr. Peter Kwasniewski. And I don't know why Facebook is doing this to me now, but I will have to scroll back down once again. Let's see. He posts a lot. So here's what he had to say on Facebook. A call for prayer, penance, and action according to one's station. This is why I've written True Obedience and Bound by Truth. We must be ready for anything, including the response of non-illicit and non-posthumous to any such Vatican ban. Kyrie eleison. Then he gives an update. He says, I was discussing this with a priest friend, and we find this rumor implausible on the face of it. Remember the gigantic effect that was supposed to drop a year or so ago, the one everybody was saying would, for sure, come out and never did. Does it seem really likely that after Fiducia Supplicans fiasco, another gamble of this scale would be taken, when there are many signs of a lack of sympathy with the program, when an extreme policy would lead only to more extreme questioning or rejection of the current pontificate and its program? His argument, I'm not sure I agree with him, but his argument is that the backlash that they would get from a new traditional Latin Mass ban would be so profound that they should be hesitating to do it. The response they've already gotten to their proposed reforming of the papacy itself, I think, shows that they are willing to take that risk. Even though a lot of people say, well, this is just a study document, it's not binding, yada, yada, yada. This is the kind of thing that they do before they go and push for something truly radical. All right, folks, let's take a look here in the live comments before we wrap this up. But I would suggest that people take this seriously and take Mr. Flanders' advice, at least on the prayer and penance and fasting thing. Unite your prayers and your penances that you already do as an act of sort of penance for these things, so that we can actually, on the prayer front, be resisting these things. It's kind of what we need to do. Propose a new dogma, says WM, no more Jesuit popes. A lot of Jesuit cardinals in the pipeline. Benedict XVI spent too much time at the Vatican Hill to not know what was going on and who he would be dealing with. Yes, but he was also reported as saying that his authority ended at his office door, and that the Lavender Group types, among the Jesuits, were reading his mail. So he didn't get a lot of what was going on. They kept him isolated. That's also why Malachi Martin said John Paul II traveled as much as he did, was to get close to the people so he could find out what was going on. Take that to mean what you will, though. What are the chances that any of these leaks are canary traps by those trying to figure out who is on whose team before a conclave, or to plug leaks? That's the other thing that did come to mind with this. Remember, I've been reporting repeatedly the Vatican is looking for ways to plug leaks. This could be one of those kind of things, a way to just stop information from getting out there by giving some sensational bit of information to somebody, a priest or somebody or a seminarian, and then see where it goes. And if it goes anywhere, that could be one of those things too. Let's take a look. Any more else? What we're seeing here. All right, looks like we're about wrapped up here. So Daryl says, I guess getting up early in the morning in Michigan, you're looking at breaking news with me. Yeah, normally, on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I usually stream a little earlier than I often do. But Tom agrees with Dr. Kwasniewski's view. I hope he's right. I really do. But then again, there's so many other things coming down the pipeline from them that we should take this seriously. One of which is that document from about the Sacred Heart of Jesus, which is coming in September for some reason instead of June. That's coming from Francis. I can't wait for that one. But I would suggest people start thinking about what they will do if this does come to pass. That's my suggestion. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. Anthony Stine, Ave Maria.